It was an ordinary afternoon when George Williams, an elderly man in his late 70s, decided to take a stroll through his neighborhood. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting long shadows on the quiet streets of the city. George had lived here for over 50 years, long enough to watch the neighborhood evolve, but not enough to feel completely comfortable with the rapid changes. As he ambled down the sidewalk, his cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement, he found a strange sense of peace. The hustle of life was distant, and George, with his wiry frame and graying hair, often took solace in the simple rhythm of his daily walks. On that day, however, the calm was broken. A black SUV pulled up beside him. Before George could even register what was happening, the doors swung open and several uniformed officers leapt out. Their sharp, aggressive movements immediately disrupted the air of tranquility. "Sir, step aside," one of the officers barked, his voice thick with authority. George, startled but not easily rattled, paused in his stride. He had lived through turbulent times, segregation, civil rights struggles, and countless moments when his very existence was scrutinized because of the color of his skin. But even after all those years, it never stopped him from standing his ground. He had earned his place in this world, no matter how much others tried to make him feel small. "What's going on, officer?" George asked calmly, his voice steady despite the tension building around him. He could see the officers were on edge, their hands hovering near their weapons, eyes darting as if searching for an enemy that wasn't there. "Are you George Williams?" another officer demanded, his tone sharper than the first. "I am," George replied. "And you are?" "We're conducting a routine investigation," the officer said, his eyes narrowing as if sizing George up. "You fit the description of someone involved in a recent altercation." George's mind immediately raced. An altercation? He had been nowhere near any kind of trouble. He was just trying to enjoy his afternoon. Still, he stood his ground. "I don't know what you're talking about," George said, keeping his voice measured. "That's funny," the officer said with a smirk, "because we've had reports of a man matching your description causing problems nearby." George's eyes scanned the scene around him. There were no signs of a struggle, no flashing lights, nothing that indicated a disturbance. It was just him, the officers, and a quiet afternoon. It felt surreal. But George had seen enough of life to know how quickly things could spiral out of control. Before he could say another word, a loud noise erupted from behind him. More vehicles pulled up. A SWAT team emerged, heavily armed and ready for action. The officers were not here to simply question him, they were preparing for a confrontation. Their movements were swift, coordinated, as if they were dealing with a dangerous criminal. George felt a pang of fear deep in his chest, but he kept his composure. He had been in tense situations before, but this felt different. The presence of the SWAT team seemed out of place for something as trivial as a mistaken identity. "Listen," George said, his voice calm but firm. "I don't know who you're looking for, but it's not me. I'm just a man trying to get some fresh air." The officers didn't seem to care. They surrounded him, their eyes locked on his every move. The atmosphere grew thick with hostility, the tension nearly palpable. George could feel the heat of their stares, the weight of their suspicion. He wasn't scared, not exactly, but he was beginning to understand how quickly the situation could escalate. As the SWAT team inched closer, George felt a shift within himself. He had lived through decades of injustice, been humiliated and degraded because of the color of his skin. But this was something different. He wasn't going to let them reduce him to a stereotype, a victim of their assumptions. And then, something within him snapped. In that moment, George realized that he had nothing to lose. His life had already been shaped by the harshness of a world that saw him as less than human, and he wasn't going to let them continue defining who he was. With a deep breath, George spoke the 5 words that would change everything. "Respect me or back off." The words hung in the air for a moment, almost as if time itself had paused. The officers who had been ready to act froze. It wasn't the words themselves, simple and direct as they were, that stopped them. It was the force with which they were delivered. George's voice wasn't that of a frail, old man. It was the voice of someone who had seen it all and was not afraid to demand the dignity he deserved. For a long moment, no one moved. Even the SWAT team, whose job it was to dominate any situation, hesitated. It wasn't fear they felt. It was something more profound: respect. They didn't expect this elderly man, this figure they had assumed was weak and docile, to stand up to them with such conviction. The lead officer, the one who had first addressed George, seemed to struggle with the words. His face shifted between uncertainty and disbelief. "Sir," he began, his voice lower now, "we're just doing our job. We didn't mean to—" George cut him off. "I've been doing your job for years," he said quietly. "You think you have power over me because of that uniform. But let me tell you something, you don't have power over me unless I give it to you." The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked to his team, then back to George. For a brief moment, the weight of what had just been said sank in. They had all been expecting resistance, aggression, even violence. But they hadn't expected defiance in the form of dignity. The situation, which moments ago had felt like it could explode into violence, began to dissipate. Slowly, cautiously, the officers backed away. The SWAT team, still holding their weapons, lowered them. The tension in the air began to loosen. And just like that, the officers who had arrived with all the certainty of their authority found themselves unsure, their actions called into question not by force, but by the mere assertion of a man's humanity. A man, they had presumed, was nothing more than a stereotype. The lead officer looked at George once more, his face softening. "Sir," he said again, his tone now respectful, "we're sorry for the misunderstanding." George nodded, the weight of the moment settling over him. "Just make sure you remember who you're dealing with next time," he said quietly. The officers, now subdued, nodded in unison and retreated to their vehicles. The SWAT team, no longer a threat, returned to their trucks and drove off, leaving George standing there on the sidewalk. He didn't watch them go. Instead, he continued his walk, his cane tapping softly against the pavement as the sun dipped lower in the sky. For George, this was just another battle won, another reminder that no matter how old or how worn down he became, no one could ever take away his right to be treated with respect. As he walked, he knew this wouldn't be the last time he would face such adversity, but he also knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he would never back down. For more powerful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to Expect Stories. Stay tuned for more inspiring content that'll move and motivate you.